Today, I'm joined by Adam Davis, and we'll be diving into a big topic in modern football: financial fair play. We'll unpack what it is, does it actually work, and who does it really benefit. If you haven't already, and if you're new to the channel, make sure to click that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you're listening to this on audio, don't forget to hit the follow button so you never miss a new episode. So let's get straight into it. There's loads of examples now of multi-club ownership, and I think it was rumoured around, and again I'm sure you'd be able to expand on this, around how regulation can be monitored easier, or things can be moved and shifted around if one club owns multiple clubs, and that helps with the books, that helps with potential regulation when it comes to FFP. What are your thoughts on it as a whole, and how that would enable sustainability from a Premier League point of view?
The final part of that I actually think is the most important part from a Premier League point of view, because we've seen multi-club ownership for the best part of 20 years now. You know, the Red Bull Group has been going properly since 2005. Same with the likes of City Football Group. That's been going since around 2008, 2009, with their when they got their first initial other club that wasn't Manchester City. Where a lot is made about multi-club ownership because it's something that is growing in prevalence in relation to the Premier League. What we sometimes forget, I think, from a British perspective, is this idea of, well, when we talk about multi-club ownership, we always talk with the assumption that our club is going to be top of the tree. This and how, you know, a good example is Chelsea and Strasbourg. This is a law that's been made an awful lot over the last couple of years. The fact that there have been so many transfers between the two, both of players and now, of course, of managers, with the likes of Liam Rosenior. And there's been massive fan protests at Strasbourg as a result of this. There is this feeling of there's a very independent club in a very independent part of France that's being used as a feeder to something, you know, close to 1,000 miles away. Just to feed the growth of someone else. Financially, there are lots of benefits to multi-club ownership. There's a way of sharing resource. There is a way of potentially looking at, well, how are these players being financed? Where can we use players? There's a great part from a talent development, player development perspective, and is used sometimes very, very effectively. For a long period of time, there was an established relationship between Brighton and Union Saint-Gilloise in Belgium, which has worked really well. And there are lots of players that have been used by Union Saint-Gilloise who have been very successful since Tony Bloom had an initial interest in them a couple of years ago. But given them important first team minutes, which means that you've got them playing under the system that works for you, that feeds into this wider structure that is important to Brighton, and the likes of Kairo Mitoma had those minutes then ready, but sort of maybe became more Premier League ready than if they come straight across from Japan. Which happens a lot across Europe. This is why we typically see multi-club ownerships, at least having feeder clubs in the likes of Portugal, the Netherlands, and Belgium. High quality leagues, very pro-immigration, really strong, and then have massive benefits that they also do quite well to move those players into the United Kingdom. So ever since Brexit, has radically changed the transfer strategy within the UK, because certain leagues receive certain amount of points that makes it easier to get that work permit to allow them to work in English football. This goes for both players and for managers. So it's a lot harder for, take Mitoma, for example. He wouldn't get that many points, even if he was Premier League ready, moving over from Japan. He has the year, he has his development in Belgium, and suddenly he's got the points that are now more suitable and more able to go and play himself in England. So there are huge business potential benefits to multi-club ownership. It's important, though, that we must look at the social aspects as well, and and going, well, is this really the way football was intended? Can we really, is it really acceptable for, okay, well, Chelsea might be able to operate slightly more efficiently at the expense of the identity and the culture of Strasbourg, for example, or the same with, you could apply that to any multi-club ownership. It doesn't want to just be like, oh, well, Chelsea are doing it wrong. It's not. They're very much working within the rules that have been set to them. And there are financial benefits. But is that really the main goal of this?
It's interesting how you mention the social aspects and the ethical element. I always think that the Premier League benefits from the multi-club ownership because it's top of the food chain, but fans seem to realise, and are starting to rebel against the nature of that. However, it would only benefit their clubs. So it's just interesting how that landscape is evolving within fandom. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think it is, and it is important to highlight that there is a balance between this. There are some fans that are, I think, a lot more socially conscious and are aware of things that extend beyond just how successful their club will be on any given 90 minutes. But they may also be the same fans that are saying, why is our club not showing any ambition? Why is our club not looking to spend more in this department or grow here? Or, because we expect better or we deserve better. And that's a lot to balance between this of going, well, what is socially and ethically right? And also, but ultimately this is my club and I want to see my club do well. And so surely I want to encourage anything that could potentially make my team better.
Do you think there's enough transparency from a business point of view? So you mentioned that implication then of making my team better from an ownership point of view. And we also talked about overspending and whether to spend, and some clubs, you know, overspend and they risk and reward. Others are a bit more calculated and they might think of the alternative. However, fans seem to rebel or lack awareness on some of those implications, some of those decisions. Do you think maybe from an ownership point of view that transparency needs to improve, or do you think that has improved over the last 20 years or so? I'm just interested on information getting to fans and letting them aware of the implications of decisions being made.
I think it's a big difference between whether the information is out there and whether people are listening. I think there's a really important distinction between the two because clubs have become far more transparent, in my view, over the last couple of years. Not necessarily entirely by their own doing, but due to the rise of social media, and the use of technology means that clubs have to be more transparent about what's going on because someone will be transparent on their behalf. Football finance is very much this case, is going, well, clubs might not make a song and dance out of the release of their club accounts, but somebody will. And okay, it's not necessarily me, but there are plenty of people on social media, excellent resources like the likes of the Swiss Ramble that fans are aware of. Independent body looking at the finances. Again, somewhat, major consultancies like Deloitte, who produce the Money League. Well, are clubs particularly wanting to go out of their way to show that revenue? Maybe. But the point is, we have plenty of resources now where we can ask those questions about our club, that we can ask more from them. If they're asking more from us, from maybe a financial or a social or a time commitment, we would potentially like to ask for more in return. And that's a way of achieving that. So I think we are seeing clubs potentially become more transparent. It's whether we accept the outcome as well. So a good example of this, I saw this fairly recently around Middlesbrough. Middlesbrough have released their season ticket pricing and have suggested that, unfortunately, we're going to have to put the prices up due to the nature of running the business. Costs have continued to spiral, and they kept the prices frozen last year. And all you've got to do is read the comments. And I think this is a really good way of looking at fandom, not just in the UK, but across the globe. Some loved the transparency, were really understanding, were really grateful, because it was clearly set out why they were increasing it, what were the things in there, and it talked about potentially some really boring stuff like national insurance contributions and increased wage costs and all these other things that the fans not necessarily that interested in. I want to see whether Morgan Whittaker's going to score next week. But they were listened to, they respected it, and they explained exactly why that decision was made. There were also some comments that were very frustrated about this, the fact that, well, our tickets are already quite expensive because they're one of the more expensive season tickets in the Championship. How can you possibly ask more for us? Stop fleecing fans, stop making us pay for this. But with that, I think we see a huge level of contradiction. And something that I have been doing a lot of research with over the last couple of years is this balance of, well, what can we really ask from a football club? What can we really expect from them? Can we really ask an owner to spend all of their money on our behalf and then be unhappy when some of it potentially ends up on us? I think transparency potentially makes that perspective slightly easier. It's as I going, well, I am willing to do this, and maybe linking it back to the Wrexham story, maybe we link this idea of, is there a way of successfully showing that we're on a journey, that this is something that you want to invest in, you want to spend your money on, because we're going in the right direction, we're doing it together. Fans are not idiots, but sometimes fans are misinformed, in my view, around this perspective. So I think it has to be part of a wider picture. This idea of, well, we're engaging with fans, we're being transparent, but the fans also need to be accepting of the conditions that these clubs are operating in, that it isn't as straightforward as this. And you cannot constantly ask an owner to spend all of their money on your behalf and then be surprised when sometimes they're looking for alternative ways to grow.
It's a fine line in that dichotomy of, is it working or is it not? And that kind of rebellious tribal nature that comes into football fandom. One thing that I wanted to ask you then, so if we kind of break down a transfer window, and you mentioned that at the beginning, kind of that emotional aspect, if a player becomes available, then do we have the funds and do we have the availability to bring a player in? If someone from a novice is kind of listening to this podcast, Adam, and they want to understand what a summer window looks like or a January window looks like, can you kind of outline what those steps are? And the second part to that question is, are we heavily influenced by data and analytic, or is there some leeway to understand the social or maybe psychological aspects of an individual coming into a kind of new culture, etc.? I'm just interested on the landscape of how that works and how that fits with business sense of bringing in, recruiting players, etc.
It is by far one of the most interesting parts, I think, because it is exciting to see, because it's a potentially an embodiment of ambition, an embodiment of growth of, well, what are our clubs interested in? Who can we get behind? Who are we going to be shouting at, either both positively and inevitably negatively, at over the course of that season? The summer window is always a lot busier than the winter window. The reason for that, it's longer, that helps. Secondly, you have a lot more initial information with this. You're in a new league, or you are, at the very least, you have a new budget, where you are, these are the parameters that we're operating with this year. Some of them, it'll be, okay, well, we're going to increase growth because we want to push towards promotion, or we're in a different league, so I'm going to have to pay by different rules, different costs, as well as we've got potentially more or less to play with based on the financials that are available to them. And it's important to stress that when we talk about the financials, we talk about three key revenue sources here about the football club. Firstly, we have match day. So this is things like season tickets, as well as hospitality. This massively is dictated by promotion and relegation. Whether people like to claim that they are supportive through thick and thin, attendances are always lower in the lower leagues. That we do see a fall off in attendance following relegation. Now, that could be the fact that people don't see it as value for money. It could be frustration with how the club is operating. It might just be simply the fact of it's a form of entertainment to us, and League One isn't as entertaining as the Championship in their eyes.
Just to add to that, so I was going to say West Ham, I think they're going through the challenge of the big stadium, and whether they can, if they drop down, would that implicate the attendances of such a big ground?
It will do at the very least. Good example of this is Leicester. So Leicester's attendances are much lower this year than when they're in the Premier League, because as someone who loves the Championship, sometimes ultimately how exciting is the Middlesbrough forward line to watch versus the Liverpool forward line or the Manchester City forward line. We can't knock fans for being like, well, this is a source of entertainment to us, and it's not the same as it was last year, so I'm not necessarily going to commit quite as much money or quite as much time, on top of all the other very important social factors that go on with your life. Of things move on, conditions change, and sometimes football isn't the number one priority, and that's also okay. Point being that all of these components, so match day being one of them, broadcasting is the second one, so this is your money you receive from the likes of Sky and TNT, and growingly the amount of money that's coming from international TV deals, of broadcasting likes the Premier League around the globe, and then the commercial deals. Again, lower attendances, lower match day viewing figures on TV following relegation means that, well, there's less bargaining power for the club to try and negotiate a deal with potential sponsors, and why we don't typically see those major household brands in the lower leagues as we do in the likes of the Premier League or the Championship. Excuse me. All of that feeds into this idea of, well, there are different conditions every year to what the next season will look like and what we're allowed to spend. So part of that is a revenue perspective. Another part of that is ownership ambition, ownership funding that's available to them. So it changes every year. But the summer window is that starting point, really, to go, well, this is what we can do this summer with the players we've got or we want to get. It is really important to highlight that the vast majority of clubs will be budgeting this throughout the year. It isn't just a case of, right, we've hit the 1st of July, and as a result, we're now going to think about the next year. They're thinking about that long in the distance. They'll be, we're recording this now in February, and they'll be already planning for next year. They'll all be looking at what's going to be there, what that budget might look like based on probability of relegation or promotion or staying where they are. They know that this big commercial deal is going to come through next year that isn't applying now. All of these things are in there. It's not just a case of we're now thinking about transfers because the transfer window has started. It's a full year process. It's just that they're actually allowed to do something in those periods of time. And what that essentially means is we see a lot more turnover of players potentially have more choice because all of these clubs are looking for new players and there's always looking for that additional spending. When we move into January, we have a smaller amount of time to operate with this. There is potentially lower choice in terms of number of clubs a player can pick. And you've also got more information than you did in the summer because you've had half the year to see what your season's looking like. Do you look between a long-term fix or are you looking for a short-term solution? We talk about this a lot from managers' perspective, but we do this with players as well. This idea of, well, let's say I'm in a relegation scrap and I've got the choice between a young player who is unproven and for the same money, I can get an experienced individual who's done this before. Long term, the youth prospect might be the more suitable option. They might be able to, because their ceiling might be higher. But you suddenly have to now be much more considerate on your short-term problems and your short-term fixes to this. And so your transfer policy may be very heavily dictated by where you find yourself in the season. We talk about this from a negative perspective of going, we weren't expecting to be in the relegation zone, yet we are. But equally, we see this a lot in the other way when you find yourself potentially unexpectedly pushing towards promotion, that actually you're going, well, if we put in, again, we come back to that point at the beginning of, but if we spend a little bit more, that could be enough to just get us over the line. You look at the quality of play and go, well, they're more interested in us now because we were an also-ran last year, but now suddenly we're a promotion hopeful. And all those sorts of things all massively feed into the willingness for players to potentially move across to you in the winter. So potentially that affects player demand. It affects your willingness or your ability to spend. But it's also important that you've got another club that are probably less willing to sell in those situations as well. What that can then typically mean is that the fees paid are arguably or potentially overinflated on their true value, of which player valuations itself is a dark art in and of itself.
Is it a sign of maybe disorganisation if the clubs are using the last day or January window to recruit players? Would you see that as kind of that perspective, or is it just the nature of the market?
I think it's potentially a combination of the two. My experience of it is that actually there are many scenarios where a deal has been rumbling along for a long, long time across that window, but eventually when you're on the final day, you have to make a call. Either from a player perspective, where they're going, well, I've got a choice of three, and I'm going to give them a month to effectively bid over me in terms of contracts, and I'll go with whoever's most lucrative. Teams will do the same, is that they've aspired to try and get 2 or 3 players that have fallen through due to a variety of factors. And so you're on option 4 or 5 for that same position, who is that we just need to get that deal done quickly. We bring up the young player versus experienced example. They're going, well, they did really want the young player, but the young player's gone somewhere else. Okay, well, we just need to fix this hole now because we've lost someone else for big money. We need to fill the gap with insert this short-term replacement here. All of those things are in there. So actually, I think there's a lot of factors in there that mean that deadline day is not seen as, we'll just get it done on the deadline day. Actually, there are lots of stuff that's been going on over that time period that has led to, oh no, we've run out of time. We need to get to the bottom. We need to get something in now. That being said, I still think there are inevitably parts of the industry that are a little bit more short-term, a little bit more wild, where there is a lack of preparation for this. But I don't think it's necessarily always the case. I think I'd be doing recruitment teams a disservice by suggesting that, that they're not doing anything for 30 days of the year, but then on the 31st of January, they're suddenly more interested. I think there's lots and lots of factors that play into it.
Yeah, it's interesting how you say that around recruitment. You always hear fans kind of question what have they been doing, but obviously they're working in the background and trying to obviously keep their cards close to their chest as well, because obviously they probably don't want to let any clubs aware of their financial situation or their business going on around. So it's like a game of chess, really, to ensure that you get the right deal, but also keep it in-house and please fans and please everything else around that. So, but one thing I wanted to ask, just based on what you've just said around the strategies, and if we take the Premier League as a bit of an example around competitive balance, and we said earlier in the podcast around, there's been a trend over the last few years of clubs getting promoted and then getting relegated. What are your initial thoughts on that? And you mentioned Sunderland as well. Do you see that changing because clubs are more strategic getting promoted, or is there still an imbalance based on competitive nature and ensuring that clubs can stay up if they get promoted? I'm just interested on your research and ideas based on that concept.
I've done a lot of research into competitive balance over the last couple of years that have looked at this, because it's something that I find really, really important and something really, really interesting that we need to investigate further. As a general trend, competitive balance has got worse across European football over the last 25 years. That's not just the case within the Premier League, but all leagues will have varying degrees of that. It then comes into, how do we define competitive balance? Because competitive balance is a really broad topic, and people will talk about competitiveness. So we can go down the theoretical route, which of course I like talking about, where we actually are looking at something I use is the Hirschendahl index, which is basically looks at how the points are distributed throughout the whole league. So a more competitive league would be that lots of the points are closer together, that there's closer points between each of those positions. And so anyone can beat anyone throughout the league, would be a good way of explaining that. Well, another way sometimes people talk about competitive balance is this idea of lots of people going for the title, that we want a title race and go, well, that must make the league more competitive. Good example of this, last couple of years, we had Manchester City versus Liverpool. And I think it was 98 points I think Liverpool finished on and didn't win the league. Well, that shows how competitive the Premier League is. Well, what it actually showed was I think third place was on 70 odd points. There was a 20-point gap between second and third. We'll go, how competitive is that really? Again, same with relegation, is that actually is a league more competitive if there's a giant gap between the bottom three and everybody else? We talk about the magic 40-point mark. We still use that as a media aspect, but actually, for the last couple of years, 40 points gets you closer to 12th or 13th, rather than whether they're going to be relegated or not. And we're a long way from when West Ham got relegated in the mid 2000s on that exact figure, and that's because the points distribution is getting wider and is becoming more heavily weighted to those towards the top. And so competitive balance is, we're saying, oh, well, the Premier League is the best league in the world, a phrase that is dangerously open to interpretation. From a competitive balance standpoint, you would potentially say, well, no, it's not, based on lots of maths. But even from a fan perspective, is that going, how much competitive balance do we actually want? This is the flip side to this is, well, I personally, I'm much more open to competitive balance as a fan of a club who is not on the larger side. We're not the most talked about, we're not the most well attended, but we're the team that I want to see win. So I want the conditions to work for my team. Of course I do. If I was a Manchester United fan, or more specifically maybe an Arsenal or a Manchester City fan, I'm going, well, I'm all for competitive balance when it suits me. When it works for me, when I'm not at the top, but now I am at the top, and I'm not so bothered about these other people. Good example for this. We talked about this there was a big call around parachute payments. Parachute payments do distort competitive balance, in my view, in the Championship, because you have a set of clubs who have got access to greater resource than everybody else. just for the fact that they were relegated. Various other things in there. There were news reports at the time from the likes of Aston Villa and Leeds United around how they wanted parachute payments to be reviewed when they were in the Championship. This because they're going, well, is this really what we're aspiring to? Leeds were particularly strong on this because we want to promote competitive balance. Upon promotion, I don't think I've heard them query parachute payments in the same way. That's not a criticism of those clubs, but it does talk about this balance of, well, how much do we really want competitive balance? Because what we really want is our club to work with the intentions of looking after our club. Leeds, of course, or clubs in the Championship naturally are going to say we need to review parachute payments because we see it as a potential barrier for success for ourselves. And if we, but should we be lucky? And luck is a major part of this. If we're lucky and we get promoted, well, brilliant. We've achieved this. So how can we maintain this position? Okay, well, we're not going to bang on about parachute payments in the same way anymore. It's all those components it's self-interest. And self-interest doesn't necessarily go hand in hand with competitive balance most of the time. And it all depends on what lens you're looking through and at what time you're looking through them.
Yeah, it's interesting how you mentioned that phrase self-interest. You could even look at it from a different equation. VAR, for example, people might agree with VAR if it goes for them rather than against them, and it's the same landscape when you mention that element of competitive balance and that element of finance and how that's distributed. Just on a more kind of looking upwards approach then, and you mentioned Man City and Liverpool in your example. Do you think that Leicester situation is something that will never happen again based on the fact that there's so many implications and data-driven motives and finance are put in place now where predictability is probably more sensible? I'm just interested on whether you think a Leicester moment of winning the Premier League from a club lower down the table would ever come to light again. And again, that's just a hypothetical example, but and it's 1 in a million, obviously, from the Leicester situation that's probably never been done before, so it's hard to agree or disagree. But I'm just interested on your thoughts on that, if that is preventing this kind of competitive nature, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's important to remember this was an incredibly unlikely scenario 10 years ago. The famous 5,000 to 1 prediction of it is a demonstration of the fact that these things were always going to be improbable. Whilst we run a league system like this, the probability is never zero, because there is so much that can be fed into this. There is so much luck involved. There is so much that a club can work towards where everything just works over enough of a period of time to make real success. Football clubs live and die by single seasons. Again, Leicester have done this the other way. Leicester were in and around Europe for many years. They had the 7th largest wage bill in the UK. And a series of mistakes and everything went wrong. And now suddenly we're looking at Leicester as a yo-yo club and with points deductions for breaking the rules. This is the same club that had the luck go all their way for a period of time, starting with survival on the final day and then winning the league the following year. That's all of that was dictated by a 12-month spell maximum. In wider business, 12 months is not a long time. We talk around many business concepts. People will refer to the short term as up to 5 years in a business plan. If you claimed in football that the short term was 5 years, fans and clubs and players would think that was mental. But that's the things we operate in. So there's a lot of luck in there. Do I think it will ever happen again? I think it's very, very unlikely. In the same way, it was very, very unlikely, 10 years ago. The financial distribution within the league makes that very hard. So one of the most useful indicators on how a league will end up is looking at the club's wage bill. So there's still a very, very strong correlation between what a club spends on player wages and where it eventually finishes. A far stronger correlation than spending on transfers. And you do get, and obviously there's going to be clubs that go away from that average. So Brighton and Brentford are often cited as the two that do buck that trend to an extent. Ultimately, they still spend a lot of money on players and more than the Championship do, and so unsurprisingly do quite well. And Manchester United, for the last couple of years, have struggled that in the opposite direction, where they've had often the first or second biggest wage bill and have not finished in first or second. But on average, this correlation is pretty strong. So as a result, to have a club that's, let's say, the 14th largest wage bill is going to be quite difficult to deviate away from the mean so heavily to suddenly win the league. And there are so many other factors that feed into it. And, we don't want to detract the amazing success that was Leicester winning the Premier League. It was also in a year when all the other clubs that you would expect to be in and around that had abnormally poor seasons and went against, they had a series of bad luck in this. So United and Liverpool and Chelsea. And then you get the phrase that somehow Arsenal came third in a 2-horse race, I think it was. Or was it Tottenham? I can't remember which it was. What that's really speaking to is this idea of lots of other clubs just weren't on it that year. Variety of factors that we could spend days talking about what fed into that. All of those had to align to see that take place. And it's as the wage gap grows between those that are at the bottom of the Premier League and the top of the Premier League, and then those below the Premier League, I think that probability becomes harder and harder to achieve.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, I think it was quite a subjective question I asked you there around kind of the nature of Leicester City and how that, there's that hope of that dramatic thing ever happening again in the Premier League. And you mentioned storytelling. I think you mentioned storytelling with Wrexham at the beginning. It aligns very much with the Leicester story. It's interesting as well, just to kind of dissect your answer a little bit more, is I always just reflecting on Leicester's success and FA Cup and everything after that. Leicester always seen as a really well-run football club, and how it's capitulated over 12 months is crazy, really, to think of that nature of where they are positioned, flirting with relegation in the Championship, to being consistently for a couple of seasons in Europe, and how that played out. Is that something clubs have to be aware of if they do get relegated? Are they looking at Leicester as a bit of an example of, we have to be careful on how we tread here if we do go down?
I think you've got to. I think the fact that actually it wasn't over a 12-month period. This is a sustained issue. Of course, Leicester have received a points deduction due to overspending. That overspending is calculated over a 3-year period. So this is not a case of it isn't necessarily a case of making poor financial decisions over a 12-month period. This is actually a sustained level of poor decision making that has led to that being an issue. Excuse me. But that is the nature of running these football clubs, is that we only know their poor decisions now because of how results have played out. I think something that is, particularly in Leicester's situation, I think something that is often forgotten, they had to have a major managerial and leadership change, was it about 5 or 6 years ago, with the death of Vijay Srinapava, that actually he was the man who led King Power, he was the man who led Leicester through the growth. They were another club, a bit like Birmingham at the beginning of this, that put in an awful lot of money to get themselves into the Premier League and turn that into a suitable asset where we're going, well, yeah, Leicester are a Premier League club. But actually, there was a long period of time, including stints in League One, where that doesn't quite feel the same way. And suddenly there's a major vacuum of power at the top there that's replaced by his son, who I'm sure, and by the sounds of it, really cares about the club, but is inherently going to have different qualities, different attributes that about his quality of leadership. Not that they're any worse, but simply that they are different. And that's going to massively affect how a club operates. All of those components will feed into this, that actually just go, well, there had to be so many variables. There are so many variables that led to Leicester winning the league. There are also many that lead to Leicester's decline in the last couple of years as well.
So you mentioned that time frame around 12 months as a short period within football, and you you kind of hinted at maybe owners are looking at 5, 6, 7, even 10-year plans for their club and where investment goes, etc. To kind of come to the end of our podcast, Adam, where do you think the future lies then within a strategy or some of the financial trends that you might see be pushed going ahead in the future? And, I don't want to bring Super League or other competitions and other things into the equation, but I'm just interested on where you see the landscape going, and is there anything that you've picked up on, just reflecting on, January window or over the last couple of years, where you go, okay, that is something that maybe those owners or clubs are going to push going forward?
I think I had the crystal ball, I'd have made a lot of money doing so. It's a real difficult one to predict. I think the Super League, although what we know is the Super League doesn't exist anymore and has officially been settled by Barcelona and Real Madrid in recent days, you could argue the Premier League is already its own version of the Super League. The spending that is available within the Premier League actually is, even those towards the bottom end, are comparable to major clubs across Europe and indirectly across the world. Even someone like a Sunderland, for example, are buying players off the likes of Feyenoord, who are one of the largest clubs in the Netherlands, or Milos Kerkez being bought off AC Milan by Bournemouth, a small Dorset coastal town by many economic metrics, have the financial might to challenge with one of the global brands of the world. That's down to the nature of the Premier League, and that's a really interesting concept around where that goes, not just for the Premier League, but where that goes for wider Europe. Is this idea of, well, how can we possibly cater and how can we possibly attack this growing entity that is the Premier League and is continuing to grow? Because of course, the main source of revenue for these clubs is the broadcasting deals. The domestic broadcasting deals, so this is the likes of Sky and TNT, actually hasn't really grown that much over the last 10 years. They pay a lot, but they're paying roughly the same as they did 10 years ago. International rights have continued to rise because more and more interest in the Premier League is continuing to grow. But then they're able to buy the better players, which means people are more interested in following those clubs. And we are seeing this growing, one of the major trends that's going to be really interesting is we're potentially seeing this growth of not fandom of clubs, but of fandom of players. And actually, if that becomes more and more entrenched and those players end up at Premier League clubs, well, that's going to feed into the broadcasting growth as well. And when those players are at the Premier League, they're not in the Bundesliga, they're not in Serie A, they're not in La Liga. And so it's a lot harder for those other leagues to potentially to compete, and it's already very difficult for them to do so. I think in the the most recent group stage of the Champions League, I think 5 out of the top 8 are from England, which they've got some of the highest wage bills, they've got some of the highest spending, they've got some of the strongest attendances. All the factors point to that this growth will continue that is doing very, very well, is having a major impact on the sporting and financial landscape of wider European football. It will be interesting to see whether they can or whether they should, they being the likes of UEFA or FIFA or other leagues, so even something like the EFC, what we used to know as the European Club Association, so the union of clubs across Europe, how much they can and should and are willing to do to try and curb the growth of the Premier League, because there is only so much money that can be spent on watching football. There's only so much time that can be dedicated to being spent around football. So how can they divvy up their own chunks of it away from this constant interest in the top end of English football?
It's interesting how you mentioned fandom and supporting a player rather than a club. I think Saudi Arabia are adopting that strategy with Ronaldo and Benzema and a few other luxury players. I can't personally get my head around how you could support a player over a football club.
No, but me neither. But it is something that is actively being monitored and is a real conversation piece for them. I think the Saudi League has started to do that. There were other aspects, I think, of the Saudi League that is really, really interesting that extend beyond just they wanted the best players. That is a major factor. I believe there are social and political factors as well that are also really interesting in that meant the likes of Benzema and Ronaldo are really interesting people to be connected to. I give this an example quite often, is that I will attend, living in the area, I will attend York City games quite regularly. And there was a child that sat behind me last couple of weeks, over a month period, came and sat a couple of rows behind me. Every time he was in a different kit. Notably, none of them a York City kit. One of them was a Juventus shirt. One of them was a Manchester United shirt. And then finally, the third was an Al Nassr shirt, all with Ronaldo on the back. And the child's geography might be excellent. I don't think he'll know where Al Nassr is, but he'll know the player on the back. And that, I think, is potentially a really interesting development of where football fandom goes, is that he just wants to see the best player. And that's absolutely fine. But it is a different way of engaging in football than I think a lot of us are used to.
Yeah. It's interesting how you mentioned the lower leagues, and if that is the way fandom's going, I think you find more traditional fans wanting atmosphere. So they go down the lower leagues, and you've got these other fans kind of looking the other way. So it's an interesting landscape on how that will play out. And I'm sure that will continue to grow, obviously, throughout the years.
It'll be really interesting to see, because we hear this a lot where we sort of go, well, we want to engage with fans, and fan engagement as a whole topic. It very much builds potentially off the assumption that all fans want the same thing. And actually, we all know that that's not the case. There's never been a case where I've ever sat in any football conversation, even with fans of my own club, and we've all agreed on the same thing. And when we say it like that, people go, well, yeah, that's obvious. But actually, from a fan engagement point of view, that's potentially kind of what we're looking towards. Even things like the independent regulator is going to come in and says, we're going to give fans a voice. We're going to listen to the fans. Brilliant. Exactly what we want to hear. Which fans are you listening to? Because there are the fans that are willing to turn a blind eye to those things because they just want to watch the best. It's an entertainment product that's important to them. They're not the same ones that have seen this growth of non-league football, where they're going, well, we want different things from our clubs. And that's built just off a UK domestic audience. That's before we even take into consideration, well, there are fans getting up at 2:00 in the morning in the likes of Melbourne or Mumbai to go and watch Liverpool on the TV, because they care deeply about Liverpool Football Club just as much as somebody from Merseyside. But they have to engage as a fan in an entirely different way. So all of those things, I think, are really, really interesting things to move forward with, about what we talk about the future of fan engagement, and then obviously the business connotations that come with it.
Where can listeners find you, Adam?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is my main one. I don't post on a huge amount, but we appear quite regularly. I contribute to both BBC Sport and BBC Newsbeat quite regularly as well, so you'll be able to hear my voice a little bit more, talk about these sorts of topics, which is always quite good. But again, yeah, if anyone wants to get in touch and talk a bit more about my work, LinkedIn is there, or my website, which is davissportsmanagement.com.
We'll put the links to your website as well as your LinkedIn in the description of below. Adam, there's probably so much we've missed in this conversation. Maybe in a few months we can revisit some of the things that we've spoke about and see where things go based on the conversations that we had and where they might play out in the future. I just want to thank you for your time. I want to wish you all the best as well with your work. Real interest in some of the things you've unpacked today, and hopefully for the listeners and viewers, they've really got some insight on that. And finally as well, I want to wish Yeovil Town well as well. You mentioned you're a Yeovil Town fan, so
very nice of you. Very rare for us to get any form of luck, so we'll take that. I really do appreciate it. No, it's been an absolute pleasure. Absolutely, always happy to come back on. There's always something new to talk about with the wonders of football finance, just because it is so chaotic at the moment, and almost so much other stuff to be talked about. So yeah, plenty more to dive into.
Thank you, Adam.